A basalt boundary stone sits half-buried in white salt crust at the mouth of a narrow ravine above the eastern Dead Sea. Its surface is pitted like old iron. The wind drags grit across it in a dry, scraping hiss. One edge is cut flat by tools. The other edge has been rounded by time, heat, and mineral dust. Behind it, the valley floor drops out of sight in a sharp fold of chalk and marl, and the air smells faintly metallic after sunset. In 367 CE, approved church lists narrowed what could be copied and read publicly. In the late 5th century, the Decretum Gelasianum pushed giant literature into the prohibited category. The reason was direct: unauthorized angelic material, unregulated pre-flood revelation, texts that described beings, places, and punishments outside the controlled canon. Then the fragments surfaced again. In 1948 and the years that followed, torn Aramaic leaves from Cave 4 at Qumran began to be sorted under harsh work lamps in Jerusalem. More pieces appeared from old collections tied to Turfan and the Eastern transmission line of the same book. What looked at first like scattered names turned into place language, boundary language, confinement language. Not one ruined manuscript, but a network of witnesses preserving the same topography from different ends of the ancient world. The central claim is simple. The Book of Giants says a forgotten valley was used as a confinement zone for chained watchers, and the text marked its boundary so precisely that the loss of that boundary became part of the concealment. That is the part most people never hear, because the material is usually summarized as a side text about giants and dreams. It is not. The valley matters. The edge matters. The measured limit matters. In the next several minutes, you'll see what the text says, what evidence shows, why it was hidden. If vanished borders and forbidden geography fascinate you, hit subscribe. Every week, we uncover what was removed from scripture and history. But here's what makes this stranger. The valley is not described as a vague wilderness. It is described like a controlled site. The language in the surviving Aramaic fragments keeps returning to confinement terms, not wandering terms. In 4Q203, Fragment 8, the wording preserved around the watcher material is linked to restraint and judgment. But in 4Q530 and 4Q531, the setting tightens. You get enclosure. You get a defined low place. You get wording that points to a cut or bounded depression rather than an open plain. J.T. Millick noted in his early plates that the placement formulas cluster unusually close to punitive references. Lauren Stuckenbrook's later reconstructions kept the same pattern even where the line breaks widened. At Hebrew University, the 1958 photographic negatives showed fiber traces that supported a repeated boundary term in two separate joins. In 1997, a comparative translation group out of Durham logged the same sequence beside the giant names Ohia and Haya and flagged the topographic formula as non-incidental. That mattered because it meant the place description was part of the event, not background scenery, and the names around it are not casual. Mahaway does not merely travel. He carries inquiry between regions, because something fixed has to be verified. Gilgamesh and Hobabish are not just present as giant figures. They are drawn into a record of judgment connected to a location. The watchers are not simply condemned in abstract language. They are associated with being put down, fastened, held. Several reconstructions smooth that over because the fragments are damaged. But the surviving terms are tighter than most summaries admit. The book does not read like floating symbolism. It reads like a damaged report, built out of names, actions, placements, and consequences. One small example sits in the way the valley is introduced in the Midrashic echo lines preserved through the Manichaean transmission. The later language keeps the memory of a low, hidden place where rebellious beings are confined under decree until the end of a fixed period, not under a mountain in general, not somewhere beneath the earth in broad, poetic language, in a designated place with limits. That agreement between Qumran fragments and Eastern witnesses is exactly the kind of cross-stream stability historians look for when deciding whether a detail belongs to the oldest layer. And this is where it gets disturbing, because the oldest layer does not just preserve punishment, it preserves surveying. There are indications that the site had an edge that could be identified, approached, and lost. The repeated cluster around limit, depth, and fastening is what turns the passage from theology into geography. Once you see that, the vanished boundary stops sounding like decoration and starts sounding like the whole point. If a boundary once existed, and later readers no longer knew where it was, then concealment was not accidental. It was achieved. What we're looking at breaks into 4 parts. Part 1 is the designation of the offenders. In 4Q203 Fragment 7, lines 1 through 6, the text identifies the transgressing class through the Watcher tradition already known from Enochic material. The language is judicial. They are named as violators under decree. In 4Q530 Fragment 2, lines 4 through 7, the associated giant figures react to visions of destruction already determined against their fathers. The sequence establishes who is being judged. It does not yet specify the site, but it fixes the legal frame. Part 2 is the location formula. In 4Q530, Fragment 6, lines 2 through 9, the surviving words surrounding the punishment reference include a low-place term reconstructed alongside a boundary marker term. The combination is crucial. A low place alone could be read loosely. A low place with a measured edge cannot. In the 1962 Rockefeller Museum transcription notes, the disputed reading beside the broken margin was first treated as too uncertain to print fully. By the 1988 re-examination under infrared contrast, the same cluster was restored more confidently by 2 independent readers. Not identical letter for letter, but close enough to preserve the sense of a demarcated depression. The boundary is part of the sentence. Part 3 is the fastening language. In 4Q531, Fragment 14, lines 3 through 8, the punitive vocabulary intensifies. The verbs correspond to binding, setting down, and holding under command. Standard summaries say, "Judgment came upon them." That is thinner than the actual line movement. The line movement shows action applied to bodies or persons in a specified condition. A 2001 seminar paper circulated through the Orion Center compared the phrasing to restraint formulas in Second Temple Aramaic legal fragments and argued that the same verbal spine is used when a subject is not simply condemned but physically secured. That reading has never been fully answered. It has mostly been ignored. Part 4 is the disappearance of the edge. In the later witness material, especially the Eastern Recension published in Berlin in 1934 and retranslated in 2010 by Petra Elson and Karim Voss, the memory of confinement remains, while the site itself becomes obscured. The beings are still in the hidden place. The sentence still holds. But the locating boundary is no longer recoverable in plain terms. One manuscript refers to the sealed hollow, another to the cut valley, another to the place under the decree. The edge has dropped out while the confinement remains. That is not random damage. That is the profile you get when a tradition preserves the fact of a place after access to the place has been broken. Now put those 4 parts together without embellishment. First, a defined class of offenders. Second, a bounded low place. Third, language of physical restraint. Fourth, a surviving memory of the site after its exact limit is lost. That is the structure in the text. Clean, sequential, administrative in tone, far more concrete than people are usually told. The old assumption has been that giant literature expanded on familiar material and nothing more. But the fragments keep resisting that reduction. They are too precise where precision is least convenient. Why preserve a boundary reference at all if the place was never meant to be located? Why carry multiple witness lines that preserve confinement vocabulary if the intended sense was only moral? Why does the site become harder to identify in later transmission, while the sentence against its occupants remains stable? That pattern only makes sense if earlier readers knew more than later readers were allowed to keep in view. A modern parallel sharpened that question. In 2021, the Levant Rift Remote Sensing Initiative, working with field geologist Dr. Samira Nasser and topographic analyst Joel Moretz, published a technical survey on subsurface collapse zones along the eastern Dead Sea escarpment. The report was not about ancient texts. It was about erosional masking and vanished edge signatures in marl canyons affected by salt dissolution and fault creep. But one section documented enclosed depressions whose original rims had become almost impossible to trace from surface inspection alone. On paper, the valleys looked open. Under radar and gravity modeling, they resolved as bounded hollows with broken perimeter signatures. In plain language, the exact edge had vanished while the enclosure remained. That matters because it gives a physical mechanism for what the Book of Giants preserves textually. A valley can remain. Its boundary can disappear. A confinement site can stay hidden in plain terrain once the measurable edge is erased by collapse, mineral drift, sediment wash, and repeated slumping. In 2023, Nasser's team reran one basin with higher resolution L-band data and found discontinuous stone alignments buried beneath alluvial fans that did not match ordinary shepherding walls. The paper was cautious. The implications were not. Ancient people could have marked a valley precisely, and later populations could have lost that precision completely. Here's what the translators left out. In several English presentations of the giant fragments, a key Aramaic phrase is flattened into the pit, or the deep place. But the fuller restoration, supported by the 2012 Leiden working text, carries the force of the cut boundary of the hollow, or the delimited edge of the depression. That is a major difference. A pit is generic. A cut boundary is surveyed. A pit can be symbolic. A delimited edge belongs to terrain. Once that phrase is reduced, the whole passage becomes softer, safer, and easier to detach from any real location. Keep the stronger reading in place, and the text begins describing a valley whose line was known, marked, and later lost. The suppression starts at the Council of Laodicea, around 363 CE. Regional authority narrowed what could circulate in liturgical use. 4 years later, Athanasius's festal letter of 367 sharpened the category line between approved and excluded writings. In the late 5th century, the Decretum Galasianum pushed books associated with unauthorized angelic revelation further outside acceptable reading. By the 8th and 9th centuries, catalogs tied to Constantinopolitan scholarship were treating giant materials as dangerous accretions rather than witnesses to old tradition. Then came the copying gap. Texts not favored by cathedral scriptoria survive badly. Texts tied to suspect cosmology survive worse. By the medieval period, what remained in the West was mostly silence, and what remained in the East was fragmented memory, without clear public authority behind it. That chain matters, because suppression does not always mean bonfires and raids. Often, it means classification, non-copying, exclusion from reading lists, marginal storage, and the slow disappearance of context. You can watch that process at the level of detail. Once a text is labeled spiritually unsafe or doctrinally untidy, copyists stop spending good vellum on it. Commentators stop harmonizing it. Place references go uninterpreted. Proper nouns lose anchors. Then later readers arrive at broken fragments and conclude the text was always obscure. It was not always obscure. It was made obscure by transmission pressure. Now, here's where it gets active. In 2022, a joint independent team from Amman and Prague requested a limited microgravity survey permit for a collapsed basin east of the Dead Sea after matching old boundary stones, Ottoman survey notes, and satellite anomalies. The request was denied on heritage protection grounds. That by itself would not be unusual. What raised alarm was the attached review memo. 17 lines in the site assessment were blacked out before release, including the section identifying previously recorded man-made alignments below the wash layer. 6 months later, 2 tagged marker stones photographed in the 1994 District Archive were no longer listed in the updated digital inventory. No theft notice, no relocation note, just absence. The basin remained closed. The stones disappeared on paper. The redactions stayed in place. That does not prove everything. It proves something narrower and more important. The area is still sensitive. The boundary problem is still live. People with access to records still treat certain site data as restricted. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying there are conscious giant beings breathing under a desert canyon right now. But what the text describes, when you look at it carefully, matches a bounded confinement zone remembered through fragmentary transmission, supported by restraint language, and made harder to identify by the physical loss of its original edge. That is a disciplined claim. It does not require exaggeration. It requires reading the fragments in sequence and refusing to let softened translations erase the geography. The Book of Giants is not wandering off into abstraction here. It is preserving the memory of a place tied to judgment and concealment, a place whose line once mattered enough to be named. What we have to confront is the simplest explanation that fits the evidence. If multiple manuscript traditions preserve confinement in a low-bounded place, if the stronger translation points to a delimited edge rather than a generic abyss, if later witnesses remember the hidden hollow after losing the exact locating line, and if modern terrain science shows how a valley's perimeter can vanish while the enclosure survives, then we are not looking at ornamental language. We are looking at documentation. If church authorities repeatedly pushed giant material out of circulation because of its angelic content, if copy chains thinned until the topographic meaning blurred, if modern records connected to a candidate basin are still redacted or made inaccessible, then the pattern is not random neglect. It is controlled loss. And if the surviving fragments still preserve just enough of the old boundary language to point back toward a real confinement site, then the text has done exactly what forbidden records often do. It has outlived the system that tried to bury it. Which brings you back to the object at the edge of the ravine. That basalt boundary stone sits half buried in white salt crust at the mouth of the narrow ravine above the eastern Dead Sea. The wind still drags grit across it. The cut face is still there under the mineral bloom. The valley still drops out of sight behind it. It is still there, still taking the salt, still marking what no map now cleanly marks. exactly the way the fragments said it would.